Un-Buddhist and Chinese Singaporean. Yes, you heard it right. And no, it's not a proper word. But none could adequately capture the junctures of the cultures that define my life. I grew up in the heart of Yangon, Myanmar's Chinese, Burmese, and Buddhist communities, and have attended international schools with third culture kids my whole life. I grew up frequenting Buddhist monasteries, praying at Sule and Shwedagon pagodas, and eating my Hindu grandmother's matmene. I'd celebrate Chinese New Year's with my cousins, eating more pork dishes than I could count, while salivating over our late grandfather's hongbao. Now, as an immigrant and permanent resident in Singapore, I live for laksa and chicken rice. I catch myself saying la at the end of sentences. My cultural identity is a mosaic of liminal spaces woven together, somehow fitting, yet somehow diverging. But for the longest time, I couldn't see how these liminal spaces could fit. My mind would fixate on how they diverged, because living in these liminal spaces meant that I'd be bombarded with comments such as, "You sound very American," or "You don't look or act Burmese." It meant that food vendors, grab drivers, strangers, at first glance and impression, would speak to me in Chinese, assuming that I could. The questions of who I am, what cultures I belong to, and whether I'm Burmese and Chinese enough, long perturbed me to my core. Questions that ignited a roller coaster reckoning with my deep inner self and the molds that failed to fit. Questions that made me feel as if I couldn't belong. I felt as though I wasn't Burmese enough, even though Myanmar was the only home I'd known for the first 15 years of my life. I was the pants-wearing sore thumb that stuck out in a sea of Burmese women covered from shoulder to toe whenever I entered the premises of a pagoda. More than anything, though, I couldn't wrap my head around the beliefs and the social norms pervasively ingrained in the culture and upheld by its adherents. To me, it felt as though the culture coddled sons as if they could do no wrong, while it held daughters to double standards and sometimes forced them to give up their dreams for their brothers at their parents' behest. It felt as though the culture forced survivors of abuse like myself and other women I know and love into silence when we spoke out about the pain and the trauma that racked us to our core. It felt as though the culture preached love, tolerance, and respect, yet refused to extend the same to my LGBTQ+ friends, instead deeming them as mentally ill sinners who were unworthy of love. To me, it felt as though the culture wanted me to be seen but not heard, silenced but not outspoken, submissive but not bold, feminine but not fierce. At odds with the customs and the values that the adherents of my culture held, I questioned whether I was Burmese enough. Yet at the same time, I also felt as though I wasn't Chinese enough, despite speaking the language and celebrating the holidays. Contrary to the cultural ethos of prudence and hierarchy that my Chinese elders and extended family instilled in me, I believed in asking questions. Questions of why an elder was considered more powerful than I was. Questions of why I was told to obey their words as if they were scripture. As an impressionable young child, I tried to be the polite, perfect little girl that the culture heralded, but I failed to do so, feeling guilty for suppressing my true inner spirit. It had gotten to the point that I'd feel a pit in my stomach when I'd say the words, 我是华侨, or I'm ethnically Chinese, in response to questions about my identity. As hard as I found it to admit, I questioned whether I was Chinese enough. I knew that adhering to every rule imposed by my cultures meant contorting myself into the pretzels I was not. Yet I also knew that confining myself to one culture meant losing the others. By not defining my cultural identity, I perpetuate the cycle of feeling ashamed of who I am and as if I couldn't belong. I had to do something. I had to define who I am. So I'd take out my iPhone notes night after night, writing down anything and everything that came to mind. Everything that I was, everything that I stood for and believed in, everything that came to mind as memories. Among them were summer Buddhist school lectures and the nights my mom and I would spend going over sermons. Among them were monastery visits and my grandmother's constant reminders to pray before going to bed. Customs that were more a matter of faith than an arbitrary attachment to a singular culture. Months of introspection propelled me to think deeply about what it meant to be Chinese and Burmese, what it meant to live out my faith in Buddha. The more I looked within, the more I found that the best parts of my cultures and faith intertwine. I found that the strong sense of community and the spirit of lending a helping hand that my Burmese culture so beautifully embodied were rooted in the loving kindness and compassion of my Buddhist faith. I found that the Chinese cultural value of honesty was rooted in the 5 Buddhist precepts and the value of respect in Buddhist worship. I found that the best parts of my cultures were in the liminal spaces. Yet I also knew that loving kindness and compassion meant treating all those among us as worthy and valued. It meant giving a voice to all. It meant extending love, tolerance, and respect to all people, including those different from us. The customs and the values that I found myself at odds with were anything but loving, kind, or compassionate. My cultures and faith both collided and clashed, but reminded of their junctures in my experiences. I realized that our cultures could change through time and through space. After all, I'd embodied a mix of them. After all, at that point, I'd immigrated to Singapore, finding myself in the middle of a multicultural metropolis surrounded by peers and friends who, like myself, were living in the junctures of many cultures. After all, having attended an international school for my whole life, I found that our world is a microcosm of each culture woven together into something beautiful. But the values of loving kindness and compassion that my Buddhist faith so fervently espoused are human values, not unique to a singular culture, but ones encompassing them all. It was in this moment that I realized that we can embrace the best parts of our cultures and our faiths. But when our cultures subvert the faiths we hold dear and perpetuate norms unbecoming of the best of us, we have the power to choose otherwise. We have the power to live in the liminal spaces while shunning orthodoxy when it becomes unkind. We have the power to define who we are and the cultures we belong to on our own terms. Reminded of this, I could belong. I could be Chinese and Burmese enough while carving my own cultural identity. So what does this look like? It means respecting my elders in line with my cultures and faith, but also blazing my path free from the shackles of cultural hierarchy. It means embracing my femininity, but also refusing to extinguish the inner fiery feminist in me. It means extending love, tolerance, and respect to all people and embracing them for who they are. I embrace my Chinese and Burmese cultures as an immigrant and permanent resident in Singapore, but I'm a Buddhist above all else, upholding the loving kindness and compassion that my faith ardently believes in. I stand firmly in the junctures of the cultures that define my life. I live boldly in the liminal spaces where nothing is, but all things can be. I'm Buddhist, Chinese Singaporean, and proud to be so. Thank you.